The sight left hardened warriors frozen. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. A city of pyramids and palaces floating on a huge lake. Long causeways stretched out, and the water was full of canoes, thousands of them. This was Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. It was so astonishing, it shattered the European view of the world. One of the conquistadors, Bernal Díaz del Castillo, he wrote later that they thought it was an enchantment. Like a dream, he said, towers and temples rising right out of the water. So the question is, how was this aquatic metropolis built? How did it function? And why did its catastrophic fall change history forever? We're looking at how a people turned a swamp into the heart of an empire, what the Spanish actually witnessed before they destroyed it. What does it mean when a civilization builds something that seems impossible? That eagle and the snake, it's more than a story they told later. It was their identity. The Mexica had been told to find a place of their own, a sign to end their wandering, and they saw it, the eagle perched on that cactus, holding the snake. That was the moment, their promised land, but to anyone else that promise was a joke. The island was just a soggy patch in Lake Texcoco. No stone, no good soil. No room for a city. The established powers like Texcoco and Tlacopan, they saw the Mexica as barbarians, troublemakers, so they gave them this land. This useless swamp, to keep them weak, to contain them. It's what you do. You push the newcomers to the worst spot. But the Mexica didn't see a swamp. They saw a blank space, and they saw a fortress. That water, the barrier to everyone else, it became their advantage. They were isolated, but that meant they could build without a constant threat. They could control who came across the lake. What was meant to make them obscure became the foundation for their power. That's the story, taking what looks like a weakness and turning it into strength. Starting with the ground, or really the water under their feet. The Valley of Mexico was this huge, closed basin surrounded by mountains, and in it there were these shallow, interconnected lakes. Where the Mexica were, on Lake Texcoco, the water was brackish, you couldn't drink it, and the ground was soft, wet, always shifting. That ground, it wasn't a foundation for a city. It was a foundation for failure, so they had to invent one. They developed this technique, the Chinampa. It became the bedrock of everything. Think of a Chinampa not as a garden, but as a piece of real estate. To build one, they'd stake out a long rectangle in the shallow lake bed. They used woven reed walls and wooden posts. Then came the layering. They'd dredge up the mud from the canal bottoms. That mud was rich, full of nutrients. They piled it into the reed frame, layer by layer. They added decaying vegetation, other organic matter. What they were making wasn't just soil. It was a self-renewing ecosystem. These artificial islands were incredibly fertile. They could yield multiple harvests every year: maize, beans, squash, flowers. They grew in abundance, feeding the city, but the genius went further. They planted willow trees at the corners of each Chinampa. The roots would grow down through the structure. They'd intertwine with the lake bed, anchoring the gardens permanently. Over generations, the Mexica built thousands of these. They arranged them in a vast, orderly grid. Narrow canals of water separated each one like streets. This network slowly pushed the city's boundaries outward. The water that once defined the island's edge was now threaded through its heart. They weren't building on the lake, they were building with it, weaving land and water into a single, living fabric. The city was growing from the water itself. A testament to meeting an impossible challenge. Some historians put the population of Tenochtitlan at its peak around 200,000 people, which was, for that time, enormous. 5 times the size of London then, and all those people had to move around. They had to trade to live. In a city built on water and land, managing that flow was the central problem. And the solution was this very logical design. The city was laid out as a perfect grid, but the main streets weren't made of stone, they were canals. A symmetrical network of them, wide and straight, running through every district. These were the highways, and the traffic on them was constant, thousands of canoes. Each one like a delivery truck or a taxi, carrying produce from the floating gardens, pottery, materials for construction. A farmer could harvest in the morning and have his goods in the central market by noon. Just gliding through these water avenues, the efficiency was remarkable. It meant no crowded, muddy streets full of carts. Goods and people moved with a kind of fluid grace. Something European visitors later found completely foreign. Then you had the connections to the mainland, 3 massive causeways, each one a major engineering feat. The Spanish said they were wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast, but they were also intelligent. They had gaps built into them at intervals, spanned by wooden bridges. Those bridges could be removed to let canoe traffic pass underneath and for defense, turning each causeway into a series of choke points. From above, the city would have looked like a wheel. The absolute center was the sacred precinct, the spiritual and political heart, radiating out from it the residential districts, the calpuli. Each calpuli was its own neighborhood. With its own local temple, its own school for commoners' children, its own smaller market that decentralized the city's needs, so not everyone had to crowd into one central place for every errand or every prayer. The whole design, from the big canals down to the local calpuli, created a rhythm, both communal and efficient, a city built for that scale but engineered for a kind of harmony. Where you could be one of 200,000 and still belong to a community right around the corner, this was more than urban planning, it was a kind of philosophy. A belief that order and beauty were necessary for a society to thrive, and right at the heart of that order there was a marketplace, so vast it would later redefine what newcomers understood about commerce. About civilization itself, the canals and causeways all led to the same place, the sacred precinct, a walled plaza at the very center, and inside it the Templo Mayor. Its twin temples rising from a single pyramid base. This was the center of everything for them. It was the center of the universe where the 3 realms met. The heavens, the earth, the underworld, and the temple was built to show that. One pyramid but 2 staircases, 2 separate shrines at the top. One shrine was red for Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war. The other was blue for Tlatelolco, the god of rain. 2 forces, war and water. They had to be in balance. The empire needed both. The sun needed to rise, that required ceremony. The rains had to fall for the Chinampas, for the crops. So this temple was a machine for keeping the world in order. And every new ruler, to prove himself, he'd start a project. He wouldn't build a new temple somewhere else. He'd build over the old one, a larger shell around it. They've found 7 layers now, like boxes inside boxes. Each layer was a renewal, a promise that the world would keep going, that the cycles would hold. The plaza around it was a stage. There was the ball court, the game. There was a ritual, a replay of battles in the sky, and the teas ampantly, a great rack holding representations of honored individuals. A reminder of the cost of that balance. On festival days, the place was overwhelming. The air would be thick with incense smoke, the sound of conch shells, drums, chanting. Thousands of voices, dancers in feathers, moving in patterns. The scale of it, the color, the sound, it was meant to awe you, to make the gods feel present, feel real. This center proved the empire had a divine right, but it also tied everyone in the city to the same story, a story about how fragile the world was and how they all had a part in holding it together. And right next to this spiritual core, just steps away, the empire's earthly power was run, from buildings just as grand. That divine order was always under threat from the water itself. A city on a lake is beautiful, but it's vulnerable. The same element that gave Tenochtitlan life and security could also destroy it. The lake water was brackish. You couldn't drink it, and the seasonal rains brought catastrophic floods. They threatened to wash away the entire grid of Chinampas and canals. The Aztec response wasn't just prayer. It was engineering, profound engineering, hydraulic projects so advanced they wouldn't be matched in the Americas for centuries. That was the unseen intellect beneath the city's beauty. The most monumental feat was the Dike of Nezahualcoyotl, conceived by the poet-king of Texcoco, their ally, a levee stretching 16 kilometers across the lake. Think of a wall built right on the water, but it wasn't just a barrier, it was a smart filter. Its main job was to separate the fresh water from the northern springs from the salty waters of Lake Texcoco that surrounded the city. That created a controlled freshwater basin around Tenochtitlan. It protected the Chinampas and the drinking supply, and it acted as a giant shock absorber for floods. When waters rose, the dike could be managed. Its gates adjusted to control the surge, a living piece of infrastructure, a testament to understanding an ecosystem. Then came the question of delivery. How do you get that fresh water to 200,000 people in the city center? The answer was the aqueduct from Chapultepec. Not a single stone channel, but a system of twin clay pipes carried on a masonry causeway. The genius was in the redundancy. One pipe carried a continuous stream of spring water into the city. The other could be shut off, cleaned, and maintained. The water never stopped flowing, a constant, clean supply. That level of foresight in public works was unheard of. These projects show a civilization thinking in cycles and in balance. They weren't fighting the lake, they were negotiating with it, partners in a delicate dance. The dikes, the aqueducts, the causeways, they were all parts of a single grand system. A system designed not to conquer nature, but to harmonize with it. On a colossal scale, the dazzling city of towers and temples the Spanish saw was only the surface. Its true foundation was this deep, fluid intelligence. Tenochtitlan had this spiritual and hydraulic brilliance, but it was also a city of incredible commerce. The Templo Mayor was the soul, and the market at Tlatelolco was the heart. Goods came in every day along the canals, but every fifth day the place would just expand, become something immense. Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote about it later, and you can still feel his disbelief. He described seeing 60,000 people there, buying and selling in a single day. The noise of it must have been its own presence. All those voices, the vendors calling out, the sound of movement over the hard ground. What really surprised the Spanish was how ordered it was. This wasn't a chaotic bazaar. It was a meticulously organized system. You'd have a whole city block for goldsmiths, working with what looked like molten sunlight. Another section for embroidered cloth, textiles said to be as light as air, streets for obsidian for those glassy black blades, aisles for pottery, all different shapes. A quarter for exotic foods where the air was thick with chocolate and vanilla and spices, sections for live animals like turkeys, which Europeans had never seen. And there was a system for service for labor. What the Spanish called slaves were often people in a kind of indentured service, with its own rules and possibilities for release, all governed by the market's codes. Watching over everything were market judges, inspectors. Their job was to ensure fair measures, settle disputes right there, keep the peace. They checked cloth quality, the weight of gold dust, the consistency of cacao beans. Because that was another thing. This huge, sophisticated economy didn't use coins. It used standardized goods, cacao beans, cotton cloaks, little copper axe monies. A system built on trust and regulation and an unbelievable volume of goods. Goods from everywhere, feathers from southern rainforests, jade from the mountains, obsidian from northern mines, shells from distant coasts. All of it flowing into this one central plaza, taxed and recorded, fueling the empire. This marketplace was the proof. Tenochtitlan wasn't an isolated wonder. It was the central node in a vast network of trade, a demonstration that the city's grandeur was built on faith and engineering, yes, but also on the sheer, vibrant energy of commerce. And that energy, that concentration of wealth and power, is what would eventually draw the gaze of strangers from across the sea. The marketplace had this energy, this life to it, and it really showed you the society that made it. A society built on order, on purpose. Everyone had a place. At the very top was the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker. He wasn't just a king, he was the empire's voice. Chosen by the gods, they believed. His word was law, though he had a council of nobles and advisors to guide him. He lived in a huge stone palace inside the sacred precinct. Gardens, aviaries full of exotic birds, halls stacked with tribute from every province. His role was to lead in war, to preside over the ceremonies at the Templo Mayor. To be the stability of the world, below him the pillars of his power, the nobility, the pili. They held the high administrative posts, governed distant provinces, commanded the army. Military success was the clearest path to status. The elite warriors, the eagle and jaguar knights, they were a revered class. You knew them by their regalia, the ornate feathers, the animal skins. And then the priests, a class of immense influence. They were the astronomers, the calendar keepers. They interpreted the divine will. Their lives were ritual, study, maintaining the balance of the cosmos through precise ceremony. These groups together, the ruling elite, they lived in relative luxury. They shaped the destiny of millions, but the true engine of the empire was the Mace Hualtan. The commoners, the farmers on the Chinampas, the artisans making obsidian blades and featherwork, the canoe paddlers moving goods, the traders in the great market. They lived in Calpuli districts, each one a tight-knit community with its own temple, its own school, a council of elders. A commoner's home was usually a one-room structure. Adobe brick, thatched roof, simple, functional. Life was hard work, family, the obligations to the Calpuli. Men farmed or practiced a trade. Women managed the household, wove textiles, sold goods at the local markets. But it wasn't a life without mobility, without a voice. Commoners could gain recognition through bravery in battle or exceptional skill in a craft. Their Calpuli had its own land allocated to families. Its own governance, it gave a real sense of belonging, of shared responsibility. At the base, the Tlacatan, often called slaves, but it was more complex. Many were prisoners of war. Others entered servitude to pay a debt or as a legal penalty, but they could own property, they could earn money, they could purchase their own freedom. Their children were born free. They were integrated into households doing domestic or agricultural labor. Their status wasn't necessarily permanent. It wasn't inherited. This system, it had hardship, but it had pathways out. Servitude was seen as a circumstance, not an identity. What held all these layers together was a sense of duty. Communal duty. Every level contributed through labor tribute, through shared religious observance. Commoners worked communal lands to support the state. They provided labor for public projects maintaining dikes, temples. In return, the state provided security. It organized the large festivals. It redistributed food when needed. The ceremonies at the Templo Mayor, they weren't just for the elite. They were communal acts, the entire city participating, reaffirming a shared purpose. A role in sustaining the universe, this web of rights, responsibilities, rituals. It created a social fabric that was resilient. It held a city of unprecedented scale together. A delicate, functioning balance, but that balance and the empire it supported was about to meet a force from across the ocean, a force that operated on a completely different set of rules. The military was where that sense of duty, of everyone having a place, was expressed most completely. The empire's expansion, the tribute that flowed into the city, all of it was powered by a warrior culture. A spiritual one for a boy. The path was set. Around 15, he'd enter the young men's house, the Toxcatl, in his neighborhood. The training was constant. He'd learn to use the obsidian club, the macuahuitl, a weapon so sharp they said it could take a horse's head off. He'd practice with the Tlatelolco, the spear thrower. But it was more than just physical training. It was an indoctrination into a code that linked your own honor to the survival of the cosmos itself. The highest goal was to join one of the elite orders, the Eagle Knights, the Jaguar Knights. They weren't just soldiers, they were symbols. In battle, they wore full regalia. An Eagle Knight was a vision from the sky, a feathered helmet shaped like a raptor's head, his body covered in plumage. A Jaguar Knight wore the spotted pelt of the cat, embodying the power of the earth. To see them was to see myth made real. Their presence alone could break an enemy's will. You earned membership through bravery, through capturing prisoners. It was the ultimate way to rise. A commoner who captured 4 enemies could attain this noble rank. He'd gain land, status, privileges for his whole family. Battle was the engine of social mobility, and this leads to the concept that most confused the Spanish, the Xochitl, the Flower War. To the European mind, war was for conquest. For land and resources. For the Aztecs, it was also a sacred ritual. These were often pre-arranged battles with rival states, fought on chosen fields. The goal wasn't annihilation, it was capture, to take prisoners who were called the precious flowers. The reason was in their cosmology. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create the sun, to set it moving. That sun needed nourishment to keep traveling the sky, to hold back the dark. That nourishment was Chalchihuatl precious liquid, a life force offered through ceremony. Captured warriors were seen as the most worthy offerings. Their strength would sustain the gods, so warfare became a grim duty, a reciprocal one, a way to feed the cosmos, to maintain the balance. For a warrior, to be captured in a flower war wasn't a disgrace. It was a sacred fate. He was giving his life to keep the world alive. This system created a self-perpetuating engine. Military success brought tribute food, textiles, feathers, gold from conquered lands, enriching the city. It supplied constant labor for building projects. And it fulfilled the state's deep cosmological duty. The whole society, from the farmer on his plot to the Eagle Knight in battle, was part of a collective, sacred effort to sustain creation. It was a worldview of profound connection, where politics, economics, and spirituality were woven into a single fabric. A fabric that, when the strangers arrived, was completely misread. The Spanish saw the ritual, the ceremony at the Templo Mayor, and they interpreted it through horror, through barbarism. They couldn't see the meaning. The cosmic responsibility underneath it all. That fundamental misunderstanding became the moral justification for what came next. A clash not just of armies, but of entire universes of thought. That warrior culture was the visible arm of a deeper intellectual world. The Aztecs were meticulous record keepers, astronomers, artists. Their knowledge wasn't just spoken. It was preserved in painted books, codices. They weren't bound like European books. They were long, folded strips made of deerskin or a paper from the inner bark of the fig tree. Each page was a canvas, vivid color. Glyphs and pictures told the stories. A codex could be a historical record, tracing the migration of a people. It could be a tribute list, showing what a conquered province owed, bundles of quetzal feathers, bags of cacao beans, jaguar pelts, or it could be a ritual guide mapping out the ceremonies for each god. These books were the libraries of the empire, how history was passed down, how law and belief moved through generations. To own them was a sign of power. To commission them was learning. Their understanding of time was the great intellectual achievement. They didn't have one calendar, they had two, moving together like interlocking gears. The first was the sacred calendar, the Tonalpo Huale, 260 days long, used for divination, for naming children, determining the fate of individuals. The luck of days, each day had its own sign and number, a combination that carried specific meaning. The second was the solar calendar, the Zu Po Huale. 365 days, tracking the agricultural year, the cycle of seasonal festivals. These two cycles didn't align. They would sync up only once every 52 years. That convergence was a moment of profound danger. The Aztecs believed the world could end at the close of such a cycle, if the gods willed it. So as that 52nd year approached, the entire empire held its breath. This led to the new fire ceremony. On the appointed night, all fires across the land were extinguished. The world plunged into symbolic darkness. Priests would climb the hill of the star. Watching the night sky, they waited for a specific star cluster to pass directly overhead. If it did, it meant the world would continue. The priests would then light a new fire. In the chest cavity of a high-ranking individual, that flame, the new sun, was carried by runners to every temple, every hearth in every city and village. It was the rebirth of time, a collective sigh of relief for millions. This ceremony shows how their understanding of the cosmos was woven into daily life. Time wasn't just measured, it was lived, a sacred, cyclical drama. Everyone played a part. That same sophistication was expressed in their art, not as mere decoration. As a language of power and identity, artisans, often in special guilds within their calpuli, produced works of breathtaking skill. Feather workers would take the iridescent green plumes of the quetzal bird, the bright red of the spoonbill, the blue of the cotinga. They'd layer them thread by thread onto a backing to create shimmering capes, headdresses, shields that seemed to capture living light. Mosaic workers inlaid turquoise, shell, and pyrite into masks, ceremonial objects, creating faces that glittered with sacred energy. Obsidian, the volcanic glass used for weapons, was also polished into mirrors. These were not for vanity. They were considered portals, tools for seers to glimpse other realms. Every crafted object carried meaning. A simple clay bowl with a glyph, the emperor's feathered headdress. It communicated status, told a story, honored a god. This artistic and intellectual output, centered in Tenochtitlan, created a rich, cohesive cultural identity. It was how the empire spoke to itself, to its subjects. Through the painted pages of a codex, it said, "This is our history." Through the precise turning of the calendar, it said, "This is our place in the cosmos." Through the brilliance of a feathered shield, it said, "This is our divine right to rule." A civilization that expressed its deepest truths not only in stone and ceremony, but in color, in count, in exquisite, careful craft. All of this, the knowledge, the art, the ordered society, was what the Spanish witnessed when they finally entered the city. And in that moment of first contact, two worlds stood face to face, each believing itself to be the center of creation. From that high pass, the world just opened up. It was November 1519. Hernan Cortés and his men, a few hundred of them, they'd been marching and fighting for months. They came up between the volcanoes Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl. The air was thin, and then they saw it, the Valley of Mexico laid out below, like a map, but a map that was alive, glittering, and in the middle, on this huge lake, was the city. Tenochtitlan, all these white towers, causeways, everything reflected in the water. Bernal Díaz del Castillo wrote about it later. He said they saw so many cities and villages built right in the water, other towns on the land. And he wrote that line, some of the soldiers wondered if it was a dream. For men who thought they knew what a city was, this changed everything. It shattered the idea. This wasn't some collection of huts. It was a rival to any capital in Europe, more orderly, more beautiful, and it was floating. That sight created a hunger in the Spanish. Awe and greed mixed together. They saw unimaginable wealth. The thought of gold was there before they ever stepped onto a causeway. But that awe, it wasn't one-sided. Down in the city, they were being watched. Messengers had been going to Emperor Moctezuma for days. Reports of strange men, bearded, wearing metal that shone. Riding huge beasts, carrying sticks that made thunder and smoke. For Moctezuma and his advisors, these weren't just invaders. They were an omen, a riddle. Aztec cosmology was full of prophecy, cycles of time. There were old stories about a god, Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent, who left eastward across the sea, promising to return. The year Cortés arrived matched a cycle in their sacred calendar, a year for portents. Were these the ones returning, or were they something else? Moctezuma was paralyzed by that. A ruler known for his wisdom, caught between protocol and fear, he sent envoys with gifts, gold, featherwork, fine cloth, gifts for a god. But that act, meant to show power, maybe to appease something divine, it had the opposite effect on the Spanish. It just confirmed the wealth that was waiting. So the Spaniards came down from the mountains. They moved toward the lake shore, toward the great causeway to Iztapalapa. With every step, the scale of the place grew. The ordered gardens, the traffic of canoes, the sound of a city. And on the other end of that causeway, Moctezuma prepared to meet what he couldn't understand. Two worlds were about to meet, a historic moment built on a foundation of total misunderstanding. The omens started years earlier, long before anyone saw sails on the horizon. Aztec historians wrote them down later: a comet, a streak of fire in the night sky for many nights. Then the temple of Huitzilopochtli caught fire, a day with no wind. And they couldn't put it out, the water wouldn't work. The lake at Texcoco foamed up, rose without a storm. They caught a strange bird with a mirror in its head. And in the mirror, stars no one recognized. And then there was a woman's voice heard weeping at night, a warning. She said, "My beloved children, where shall I take you?" These weren't just superstitions. In that world, the natural and the supernatural were the same thing. So these were cracks in reality itself. They meant something was coming. A rupture, a shift in the cosmic order. So when the runners finally came with news of the strangers, pale men with beards, riding beasts, living in floating towers, that wasn't just a military report. It was the last piece, the final, terrible piece of a prophecy clicking into place. For Moctezuma II, this created an impossible problem. He was a scholar. A priest-king. He knew the sacred calendars, the old stories. One story was about Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, wind and wisdom, a benevolent god, a civilizing force. He'd left long ago, gone eastward across the sea, and he promised to return one day in a specific year, and that year, by the Aztec count, was now. These strangers came from the east. So, could this be the god's return? If he greeted them with hostility, and they were divine, he'd bring catastrophe on his people. But if he welcomed them as gods, and they were just men, then he'd be surrendering his empire. To a ruthless deception, his indecision wasn't weakness. It was a crisis of cosmology. His whole framework for understanding the world was being tested. So he chose a path of cautious diplomacy, lavish diplomacy. He sent embassies to the coast, one after another. They carried magnificent gifts, finely wrought gold discs big as cartwheels. Symbols of the sun, silver, exquisite featherwork. These weren't bribes, they were offerings fit for a deity, meant to show reverence and maybe to discern the visitor's true nature. The effect, though, was catastrophic. To the Spanish, these treasures weren't spiritual symbols, they were proof of unimaginable mineral wealth. Each gift meant to honor only deepened their resolve to find the source, to possess it. Moctezuma also sent word. He pleaded with the strangers not to come to the capital. He talked about the hardship of the journey, the poverty of his city. It was a polite fiction, a desperate attempt to keep this destabilizing force at bay. Without giving direct offense, Cortés understood none of the spiritual weight. He was a master of perception, but he saw only the hesitation of a fearful ruler. So he pressed forward, he exploited every ambiguity, and when Moctezuma finally sent a formal invitation for the Spaniards to enter Tenochtitlan, that likely wasn't an act of welcome. It was resigned protocol. To refuse a guest, even a dangerous one, would violate sacred custom, so the gates were opened, the physical ones and the metaphorical ones. The emperor's response, shaped by omens and ancient lore, had created a fatal opening. He prepared to meet what he feared might be a god, and the man approaching saw only a king to be overthrown. A city to be plundered. That disconnect, that profound disconnect, it set the stage for one of history's most consequential meetings. The Spanish arrived on the 8th of November, 1519. They came down the Iztapalapa causeway, a few hundred men in steel, and behind them, thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors. The city gates were open. At the entrance to Tenochtitlan, a procession was waiting. The emperor was at the center, Moctezuma II, on a litter covered in gold and quetzal feathers. Nobles swept the ground in front of him. No one could look at his face. It was a display of absolute authority. Then he stepped down. He approached Cortés. Through interpreters he spoke. According to the Spanish, his words were staggering. He reportedly said, "You have come to sit on your throne." To Cortés, this seemed like madness or a trick, but in Moctezuma's world, it was a possible recognition. A way to acknowledge this might be a rightful power returning, a way to navigate the omen. It was a greeting of profound ambiguity. Was it surrender or diplomacy? A welcome or a test? The Spanish were then escorted into the heart of the city. They were given the palace of Causeways, Moctezuma's father, a building of stone and cedar. From there, they were guests of the state. For days, they were shown the wonders. They saw the immense market at Tlatelolco, the volume of goods. They were taken along the Grand Canals, watching the canoes. They saw the Chinampas, the floating gardens, and understood how the city fed itself. Each sight deepened their amazement and their calculation. Then came the tour of the sacred precinct. The Templo Mayor. Here, the two worldviews collided. They climbed the pyramid steps. At the top, they entered the twin shrines. They saw the statues of the gods crusted with dried offerings. They saw the evidence of the ceremonial practices. The Spanish, devout Catholics saw it through a lens of horror. To them, this wasn't a theology of cosmic renewal. It was diabolical. Proof the city was in thrall to a terrible darkness. That religious horror, mixed with the gold they saw everywhere, created a toxic certainty. A conviction they were not just conquerors but liberators, on a holy mission, and all the while they lived in a palace next to Moctezuma's own. They ate his food, watched his ceremonies, studied the city from its center. Moctezuma's strategy of hospitality, of containment through honor, had backfired. Instead of appeasing a potential god, he had handed his enemies the keys to the kingdom. A perfect base of operations, time to plan, time to understand the city's vulnerabilities. The invaders were no longer a rumor, they were in the throne room. And their awe was hardening into a plan. The uneasy peace couldn't last. It was built on a misunderstanding so vast, it could only end in violence. The uneasy peace lasted less than 7 months. A time of mutual suspicion, a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came with a sacred festival, the month of Toxcatl, dedicated to Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror. God of fate and night, it was one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, a time of renewal, dancing and music in the great plaza. The nobility would participate, unarmed, in their elaborate regalia. To the Aztecs, it was a necessary ritual, a beautiful one. To the Spanish left in charge, it looked like something else entirely. Cortés had been forced to march back to the coast. To confront a rival Spanish force sent to arrest him, he left Alvarado behind, Pedro de Alvarado, with about 80 men to guard Moctezuma and the treasure. Alvarado was a man of action, not subtlety. He saw the gathering of Aztec nobles in the sacred precinct. He heard the drums, saw the dancers, and he feared it was the prelude to an uprising. A massive, coordinated attack. Whether that fear was based on genuine intelligence or just paranoia is still debated, but his response was swift and catastrophic. He ordered the gates of the walled precinct sealed. Then his men, in full armor, fell upon the dancers. It was a slaughter. The nobility, the flower of Aztec society, cut down where they stood. Hundreds lost their lives in that single act. The sacred plaza ran red. If there had been any hope of coexistence, it died in that moment. The city didn't just get angry. It erupted, a collective fury born of sacrilege and betrayal. It swept through every district. The Spanish compound was immediately surrounded. A relentless siege began. When Cortés fought his way back to Tenochtitlan weeks later, he didn't return to a guest palace. He fought his way into a fortress under attack. He reunited with Alvarado's battered force. But they were trapped now. The canals were blocked, the causeways were watched, the market was closed to them. Their food and water began to run out. The city they had marveled at had become a prison, a beautiful, deadly prison. In a final, desperate gamble, Cortés forced Moctezuma to appear on a rooftop, to plead with his people for calm. It was a terrible miscalculation. The emperor, already seen by many as compromised, was met not with obedience, but with a hail of stones and arrows. He was struck, he retreated inside, and within days he was gone. The Spanish claimed he died from his injuries. Aztec sources later suggested the Spaniards killed him in their frustration. His passing removed the last figure of authority who had tried to bridge the two worlds. However hesitantly, the city now had a new, determined leader. Moctezuma's brother, Cuitlahuac, and his only goal was to expel the invaders completely. The Spanish position was now untenable. They decided on a desperate escape. A silent one. They would try to slip out over one of the causeways at night. They loaded themselves with as much gold as they could carry from the royal treasure. On the rainy night of June 30th, 1520, they crept out of their compound onto the Tacuba causeway. They were discovered almost immediately. Alarm conch shells sounded across the lake. Canoes swarmed the sides of the causeway. Warriors attacked from the water and from behind. The Spanish, weighed down by gold and armor, were trapped on a narrow road. Gaps where the bridges had been removed. What followed was chaos, carnage. Men and horses plunged into the dark water, dragged under by the weight of their loot. Others were overwhelmed on the causeway itself. By dawn, hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies lay dead. The lake was littered with bodies. Glittering with discarded treasure, the Spanish would later call it La Noche Triste, the sad night. It was a crushing military defeat, but it was not the end. Cortés, wounded, had survived, and for the Aztecs, driving the invaders into the lake was a victory. But it was a victory that would convince the Spanish of one thing. They could not negotiate for this city. They would have to come back and break it. The lake that was their lifeblood became their cage. Cortés escaped the sad night, but he didn't stop. He went back to his Tlaxcalan allies. They saw the Spanish as a weapon to break Aztec power for good. He spent months there building a new army, not just Spaniards. Tens of thousands of warriors from rival city-states. They all had old scores to settle, tribute they'd refused to pay. This wasn't just a Spanish fight anymore. It became a civil war with Cortés leading it. His real plan was for the water. To beat a city on a lake, you have to control the lake. He had his men build 13 brigantines. Small, fast ships. They built them in pieces, carried them overland, and put them together at the lake's edge. When they launched, they were monsters in that world. Floating forts with cannons, they could outrun any canoe, blockade the causeways, hit the city from any angle. the Spanish now had the mobility that had defined Tenochtitlan for a century. The man facing this was Cuauhtémoc, Moctezuma's nephew. He wasn't paralyzed by omens, he was a warrior. He fortified the city, gathered what food he could, and waited for the siege he knew was coming. In the spring of 1521, the noose tightened. Cortés came back with his huge allied army. He split his forces to attack from 3 causeways at once, and his strategy was methodical. It wasn't to take the city, it was to unmake it. They started by destroying the aqueduct from Chapultepec. The clean water stopped, then they targeted the dikes. The whole hydraulic system that managed the lake's salt and floods was smashed. Then they used the brigantines to control every canal. They cut the supply lines completely. No food in, no one out. Inside the island, things got desperate. The population was swollen with refugees. Food ran low. Then came an enemy worse than any cannon. Smallpox, a disease completely foreign to the Americas. Brought by one infected Spanish soldier, it swept through the crowded city. With no immunity, the death was catastrophic. It went through families, through the warriors. It killed leaders and farmers. The social fabric, already strained, began to unravel. Still, for 93 days, the Aztecs fought. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the Spanish. They adapted. They built barricades across canals overnight. They lured brigantines into narrow channels and attacked from rooftops. They captured Spanish soldiers and, in a final act of defiance, executed them on the temples their enemies had desecrated. Cuauhtémoc refused every offer to surrender. But for every barricade they built, the Spanish and their allies tore it down. For every canal they defended, the brigantines found another way. The attackers advanced by demolishing the city as they went, filling the beautiful canals with rubble from the houses they destroyed, turning the aquatic grid into a wasteland of broken stone and choked waterways. The end came on August 13, 1521. The last defenders, starving and sick, were pushed back to Tlatelolco. Cuauhtémoc tried to flee by canoe and was captured. The fighting stopped. The empire was over. In 3 years, the floating city that had dazzled the world was a smoldering ruin. Its temples toppled, its canals filled, its people gone. The Spanish would drain the lake and build their own city right on top, using the stones of the Templo Mayor for their cathedral. It was an erasure, physical and symbolic. The conquest was more than a military defeat. It was the end of a worldview, a way of seeing time, the cosmos, humanity's place in it, shattered by forces it could never have imagined. You hear it in their own words. The conquistadors wrote home, and their letters are full of this genuine wonder. Bernal Díaz del Castillo called the city an enchantment, a dream. Cortés, in his reports, he goes into the markets, the canals, the stonework with this meticulous respect. They compared it to Venice, to the great cities from their own stories. They recognized the achievement. They were standing in a civilization that had solved problems of urban living, of water, of society, in ways Europe hadn't even imagined. This wasn't just wealth, it was brilliance, and that recognition created a dissonance, because right alongside that awe was this burning, singular greed. The gold they saw wasn't art. It wasn't a symbol for a god. It was currency, potential wealth beyond any dream, and their religious conviction was absolute. They were devout men of their time. To them, the pyramids weren't monuments to a complex world. They were temples to false idols. The very beauty of the city, its order, made its spiritual life seem more dangerous, more seductive. It had to be not just conquered, but cleansed, redeemed. That split, that ability to admire and then systematically dismantle, it defines them. So the demolition after the siege wasn't just chaos, it was a deliberate campaign. It served two brutal purposes. First, the material plunder. They tore down palaces and temples to get at the gold leaf, the ornaments. They melted exquisite works of art, objects that took master craftsmen years, into ingots. The value as metal was all that mattered. The cultural meaning, the artistry, was literally melted away. The second purpose was ideological erasure. They had to break the old world to build the new. The great Templo Mayor, the center of the Aztec universe, was methodically taken apart. Its stones were hauled away to build the foundations of the new Spanish city, and the cathedral meant to replace it. The sacred precinct was paved over. The canals they had marveled at were filled with the rubble of the buildings they destroyed. That's the haunting contradiction. The most detailed descriptions we have of Tenochtitlan at its height come from the men who were instrumental in its ruin. They preserved its memory in writing even as they worked to erase its physical reality. Their legacy is documentation and annihilation. They were stunned by what they found, and that very wonder seems to have fueled the destruction. To eliminate a rival so complete, so magnificent, required not just defeating its army, but obliterating its very image from the earth. Yet in their own accounts that image remains. Vivid, undeniable, a ghostly testimony to what was lost, written by the hands that ensured its loss. And from that rubble, a new city would rise, but its foundations would forever be haunted by the genius of the old. The stones of the Templo Mayor, they didn't disappear. They just got a new purpose. From the ruins of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish started building the capital for New Spain. They named it Mexico City, taking that name from the Mexico they'd conquered. This wasn't building on empty land. It was a transformation. They kept the Aztec city's grid, the traza. But the shimmering canals where canoes used to be, they filled those with rubble and earth. To make streets for carts and horses, they repurposed the old city's bones. Carved serpent heads, blocks from the pyramids, stones from homes, all hauled off, to form the foundations for new churches, for palaces, for convents. And right at the center, the most powerful symbol, where the twin temples of Huitzilopochtli and Tlatelolco once stood, they started building their massive cathedral. Stone by stone, the sacred precinct of one world becoming the sacred plaza of another. That new central square, what we call the Zocalo now, it sits directly on top of that ancient ceremonial heart. The physical overlay was the whole point, a statement in stone and mortar, conquest and conversion, the old gods buried and a new faith built right on top of them. The colonial city was designed to look European, grand Baroque churches, orderly plazas, a piece of Spain brought across the ocean, but its foundation was entirely Aztec. Every building, every street rested on the labor and the legacy of the civilization it was replacing, which gave the city a profound, uneasy double identity from day one. And the lake, the thing that gave Tenochtitlan its life, it refused to be subdued. The Spanish filled the canals, but they couldn't erase the geography. The Valley of Mexico was still a closed basin. The rain still came, and without the Aztec dikes, without their water systems the Spanish had destroyed during the siege, the new city was horrifically vulnerable. For centuries, Mexico City suffered catastrophic floods. Great sheets of water would pour into the valley, submerging the colonial streets, ruining buildings. The floating city's greatest challenge had become its successor's recurring nightmare. The solution, after hundreds of years, was as radical as the Chinampas. They decided to drain the lake, a vast network of tunnels and canals dug through the mountains to the north to let the water escape, one of the largest hydraulic projects of its time. Slowly, over generations, the Great Lakes shrank. What was a glittering expanse of water became dry land. The island capital wasn't an island anymore. It forever changed the region's ecology, the very air of the city, but it finally stopped the floods, so the colonial city, European in its architecture and faith, was now permanently anchored to the ancient lakebed. A literal layering of two worlds, a Spanish city built with Aztec stones on a drained Aztec lake, governing people largely descended from Aztec people. That complex, contested layering isn't just past, It defines the modern Mexico City you walk through now. When you stand in the Zocalo, you're standing at the precise point where two universes collided. And beneath your feet, the old stones are still there, holding their stories. For a long time, the city was just gone, buried under everything that came after. Then in 1978, in Mexico City, workers were putting in a cable. Their tools hit something, not a pipe, a huge stone disc more than 10 feet wide. They cleaned it off. There was a figure carved into it, a woman in pieces, beautiful and frightening. That was Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess. In the old stories, her brother Huitzilopochtli killed her and threw her down the mountain. And they found this stone right at the bottom of where the Templo Mayor used to be. That was the proof. It meant the city was really there, just under the streets. That one find started everything. The Templo Mayor project began. For the first time, they could dig down through the modern layers, get to the Aztec world. And they found this time capsule. The temple wasn't one building. It was built in layers like an onion. Each ruler would cover the old temple with a bigger one. They found 7 of these layers. You can see them at the site now. Different colored stone, staircases that lead into walls, history stacked up, a physical record of power. But it was more than a building. It was a place for offerings, things buried to make each new phase sacred. They found tens of thousands of these offerings. Seashells from far away, jade from Guatemala, rubber balls, animal bones, eagles, jaguars, a wolf dressed like a warrior. Each one was a statement, a map of what the empire controlled. A show of wealth and duty, a whole way of seeing the world where every object meant something. Then there was the skull rack, the Ts Ampantle, just east of the temple. They found a platform with a rectangular structure, rows of holes, and in those holes over 600 skulls, many still locked together. This was a monument, not a pile. Studies show the people came from different places, men and women. They died in ceremony. It's the physical evidence for what the Spanish wrote about. The scale of it, it makes you face the reality of their beliefs, life and death as an exchange with the gods. All of this, it lets us get past the Spanish accounts. Those were written by conquerors, full of their own fear and bias. The archaeology is different. It's a silent testimony, a piece of broken pottery with a mark. Where a bead was placed, how a skeleton was facing. These are pieces of the Aztecs' own story. They fix the record, they add detail. They show a civilization that was deeply sophisticated, deeply religious. And sometimes deeply unsettling. The buried city is talking again, not with words but with things left in the earth. And as they keep digging, every new layer asks us to think again about the people who built their world on the water. That system of canals and raised fields, it was more than engineering, it was a way of life. The Chinampas were the economic engine of Tenochtitlan, a masterpiece of sustainable agriculture built from the lake itself. They weren't floating gardens, they were carefully constructed plots anchored to the lake bed with willow trees and the canals between them. They weren't just waterways. They were nutrient highways. Farmers would dredge the muck from the canal bottoms, the rich organic material, and layer it onto the Chinampa beds, constantly renewing the soil. It created a cycle of fertility, almost magical in its productivity. A single Chinampa could yield up to 7 harvests in a year, an unimaginable output for a pre-industrial society. They grew maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, chilies, flowers. The secret was the design. The canal water kept the roots irrigated. The decaying vegetation in the beds generated a gentle heat. A consistent heat which protected the crops from frost. This wasn't farming against nature, it was farming with it, a rich, artificial wetland ecosystem. Supporting fish, waterfowl, and crops all at once. A closed loop of abundance, turning a shallow lake into the most productive farmland in Mesoamerica. And the most remarkable part, this ancient system never really died. In the southern district of modern Mexico City, in the canals of Xochimilco, you can still see working Chinampas today. Farmers there, called Chinamperos, they use techniques passed down for generations, growing flowers and vegetables on these same fertile beds, poling their trajineras, the colorful boats, through the same waterways. It's a living museum, a direct thread back to the Aztec world. Xochimilco is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized for its beauty and for this enduring agricultural tradition. That endurance speaks volumes. In an age of industrial farming, with chemical fertilizers and vast monocultures, the Chinampa stands as a counterpoint. A model of local, intensive, ecologically integrated food production. It requires no fossil fuels. It enriches its own soil. It supports biodiversity. The lesson isn't that we should all build Chinampas. The lesson is in the principle. The most resilient solutions come from a deep observation of a place. From working within an ecosystem, not trying to dominate it, the Aztecs faced an impossible environment, a swamp, and instead of draining it, fighting it, they learned its rhythms. They built a civilization from its logic. As we face our own sustainability challenges, that ancient ingenuity, still alive in the quiet canals of Xochimilco, offers a question. What can we learn from the past about building a future that doesn't just extract but regenerates? For the people who built it, Tenochtitlan was a prayer. Made of stone and water, every part of its design was a deliberate act of cosmic alignment. The grand causeways, the humblest canal, the city wasn't just built on a lake. It was built to be a model of the universe. At the absolute center stood the Templo Mayor. This pyramid wasn't merely a temple. It was a representation of Coatepec, the Serpent Mountain. The sacred site from their most important myth, where the patron god Huitzilopochtli was born, fully armed to defend his mother. By building this mountain in their city's heart, they anchored that divine victory. That moment of order over chaos into the very ground of their home. It made their capital the stage where myth became daily reality. The city's layout made this tangible. The four main causeways stretching out toward the lake's shores, they weren't just practical roads, they were cosmic axes, aligned with the cardinal directions, structuring the city as a sacred cross. A living map, this design declared Tenochtitlan the navel of the world, the precise point where the vertical axis of the heavens, the earth, and the underworld met the horizontal plane of the four directions. To live within this grid was to live inside a diagram of creation. Your neighborhood, your local canal, your path to the market, all of it existed within this sacred geography. You weren't just going about your day, you were moving through a ritual space. This worldview transformed every civic duty, the immense labor to build the dikes, to maintain the aqueducts, to dredge the canals. This wasn't just civic engineering, it was a collective ritual, a way for every commoner, through their tribute of work, to participate in holding the world together. The tribute from conquered provinces, jade, feathers, cacao, cloth, it wasn't just wealth, it was the lifeblood of the cosmic center, offered to sustain the machinery of the universe. And the ceremonies at the Templo Mayor, with all their solemn pageantry, that was the essential maintenance of reality. The sun needed strength for its daily battle. The rains had to be persuaded to fall. The city, through its rituals, provided that strength. It was an active participant in a fragile, eternal negotiation. So when a mason placed a stone or a farmer dredged a canal, they were doing more than a job. They were fulfilling a covenant, helping to stave off the ever-present threat. The potential for the sun to not rise, for the world to slip back into primordial darkness. This belief system explains the staggering scale, the endless cycles of construction. The grandeur of the festivals, the resources poured into ceremony, it wasn't for show, it was for survival. On a spiritual level, the city's very existence, its order and beauty, was what kept the universe running. That's why every stone, every stretch of water carried a weight far beyond its physical form. It was all charged with meaning, a meaning that, when the strangers arrived, remained utterly invisible. They saw a city of gold. They never saw the universe it was built to sustain. Tenochtitlan in 1519, when the Spanish first saw it, it was enormous. A city of maybe 200,000 people. That's what Cortés and his men were looking at. In Spain, Seville had 60,000, London had 50. This place was on the scale of Constantinople. Or the capitals in China. It forces you to rethink things. This wasn't some empty land. It was a world with its own peaks, but the size is one thing. The condition of it was another, the order. In Europe at that time, Paris was a mess. Streets were sewers. London was cramped, unhealthy. Here, it was different. The Aztecs had a system for waste. They didn't just dump it, they collected it, processed it, used it to fertilize the floating gardens. They had public latrines. Sweepers for the streets. The Spanish wrote about this. They walked on stone causeways. The air didn't smell like an open gutter. It was a managed place. You could think of Venice, another city on water, but it's not the same. Venice was a cluster in a lagoon. Tenochtitlan was a huge, symmetrical grid on a lake. Its canals were for moving food, for a population much larger than Venice's, and where Venice's canals could sit still, these were part of a system with flow. With purpose, it breaks that old story, the idea that civilization moves in one line, from the old world to the new. This was its own path, a society that saw a lake and built a blueprint. They solved the problems of a city: waste, water, transport. Their solutions worked. In some ways, they worked better than what Europe had at the time. It's a humbling thing. Ingenuity doesn't belong to one place. It can start anywhere. Given the right conditions, it burns just as bright. Tenochtitlan was one of those flames. Built by people who understood their place in the cosmos and in the landscape they shaped. The walls of stone and water were finally breached, but the weapon that did it wasn't something you could see. The Spanish had their cannons, their allies, the siege, but something else was already moving through the island. It had come months before. A single infected person from the Spanish side brought it in. Smallpox. In Europe, people had resistance, generations of it. Here, in a hemisphere that had been isolated for so long, there was no memory of it, no immunity. What happened next wasn't just an outbreak. It was a demographic earthquake. The virus moved fast. The city was packed, full of refugees. It traveled the canals, the causeways, the very pathways of life in Tenochtitlan. The symptoms were clear: high fever, sores covering the body. There was no cure, no treatment. Families watched. People died in days. The social fabric, already torn by siege and hunger, began to unravel. The disease didn't care about rank. It killed the old and the young, farmers, artisans, and it killed warriors, the ones needed to hold the barricades, to paddle the war canoes. Their numbers fell not just from battle, but from this invisible attrition. Then it reached the leadership, the Emperor Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's successor. A determined military leader, he died of smallpox after just 80 days in power. That loss broke morale, broke organization, right at the most critical moment. The chain of command fractured. Think of the psychological toll. In the Aztec mind, illness could be divine punishment, a sign of disfavor. This plague came with the strangers. It ravaged their people but seemed to spare the invaders. It must have felt like a supernatural judgment. It sapped the will to resist. Their rituals, their prayers useless against this new threat. By the final weeks, the city was a place of deep suffering. The sounds of battle mixed with the cries of the sick. The beautiful canals, once symbols of life, may have become places for comfort. Or for the difficult tasks a community faces in overwhelming loss. Organized defense crumbled. When the final Spanish assault came, many who might have fought were too weak to lift a weapon. So the conquest narrative changes. Spanish steel, indigenous alliances, tactical brilliance, they were decisive, but they operated inside a space already collapsed by disease. The fall of Tenochtitlan, the collapse of populations in the following century, it's one of history's sobering lessons. The fate of civilizations can hinge on microscopic exchanges. Not just epic battles, the story is about two long-separated biological worlds colliding. The consequences echoed for generations, and from the ashes of that catastrophe, a new, blended society would begin to form. Carrying fragments of the old world into an uncertain future, the conquest ended the city physically, but not in spirit. They repurposed the stones filled in the canals, but the memory wouldn't stay buried. It changed from a capital, a living city, into a symbol, a powerful one. It sits right at the center of what it means to be Mexican today. You see it on the flag. That eagle on the cactus eating the snake, that image comes straight from the Aztec founding myth. It was the sign for the Mexica people, telling them they'd found their home. Putting that ancient prophecy at the center of the modern country, that's a statement. It says the nation's story doesn't start with the Spanish, it starts earlier. With that moment of guidance on the lake, it ties pride to an indigenous past. Go to the Zócalo, the main square. You're standing in the middle of that conversation. There's the huge cathedral, the Baroque style, and right there, the excavated ruins of the Templo Mayor. They're side by side. It's not a neat timeline. It's a dialogue made permanent, made physical, one sacred center holding up the next. You see the colonial stonework, and right next to it, the carved serpents, the red temple walls from the Aztec world. It's more than an archaeological dig. It's a metaphor built from stone. It shows the nation's complex soul, a fusion, two worlds layered together, often in conflict but joined. Artists keep coming back to this. Diego Rivera, his murals in the National Palace. He painted Tenochtitlan as a bustling, colorful place, a sophisticated civilization. That was the point, to reclaim it, to say, look at what was here, what was built before the conquest. Modern books, films, music, they all return to this moment. It's a source of indigenous pride, a reminder of what was lost, the autonomy, the genius, but it's also a trauma, the story of a great city betrayed, besieged, and broken. You have to hold both, the glory and the pain. It's not picking one story. It's admitting the Mexican present was made in that huge, violent encounter. That resilience gives the city another life. It lives on in the imagination, as inspiration for art, a place for historical thinking, a foundation for identity. The story makes you think about how nations are built from many pasts, how destruction can lead to new kinds of memory, and how a place, gone for centuries, can still shape the heart of a people long after its stones went quiet. The idea of a floating city is a beautiful one, but it's misleading. Tenochtitlan wasn't built on rafts. It wasn't drifting. For a city that size, that would have been impossible. What they did was different. They expanded the land itself. They turned the lake into solid ground. The method was the Chinampa. We know them as gardens, but their first purpose was engineering. To make one, you'd mark a rectangle in the shallow water. You'd build walls from reeds, use wooden posts for a frame. Then you'd start dredging. You'd take the rich mud from the canal bottoms. You'd pile that sludge into the frame, mixing in old plants. You weren't making a temporary platform. You were making a permanent island, but the real anchor came next. They planted willow trees at the corners. Over years, those roots would grow down, through the soil, through the reeds, into the firm clay of the old lake bed. Those roots were like rebar, a net under the earth, locking everything in place. They built thousands of these over generations, arranged them in a grid with canals between each plot. They pushed the shoreline out slowly. They were creating new land where there was only water. So from a distance, what you saw was a city of white buildings and temples. And between everything, you saw water, canals everywhere. That effect, the buildings rising right from the shimmer, created the illusion, the floating world. The genius wasn't about defying gravity, it was about controlling water. They weren't making the city float, they were managing what surrounded it. They built dikes to control floods, to separate fresh water from salt. They dug canals for boats for irrigation. They understood that lake environment so well they could reshape it for human need, and that distinction matters. It shifts the wonder from something mythical to something practical, to large-scale engineering. The Aztecs saw a wetland, a challenge. They didn't see an obstacle. They saw a blueprint. The question wasn't how to avoid the water, it was how to build with it. The answer was a city of anchored earth and managed canals. Human ingenuity working with the natural world. Tenochtitlan's deepest strength was its connection to the lake. That connection was also what destroyed it. The city never separated itself from its environment. It used local materials. Its roads were canals. That was the transport system. Water moving everything, no wheels, no congestion. Waste wasn't thrown away. It went back into the gardens, the Chinampas, to feed the soil. It was a circular economy, a living system. The canals were like arteries. The gardens were like lungs. The Chinampas are the lasting example. High-yield agriculture built right into the city. Food grown inside the city limits. No long transport, no spoilage. It renewed itself. No chemicals, just water and organic matter. It's a model of local food and ecological balance that modern cities still can't match. But that specialization carried a huge risk. Everything depended on the lake. The food, the water, the city's defense. All of it required that aquatic balance. A long drought, a broken dike, a sabotaged water system, any of it could bring the city down. It was integrated but vulnerable. So many people on one island, relying on one system. It was susceptible to collapse if the system was attacked. The Spanish conquest showed what happens when you ignore that context. To build their European city, they took apart the Aztec water systems. They filled the canals, they drained the lakes, they cut the tie between the city and its foundation. The consequence was centuries of flooding. The water had nowhere to go. Then the ground sank, the lake bed without water compacted under the weight of stone buildings. Mexico City still deals with that legacy. Sinking monuments, water shortages, drainage disasters. All from the decision to conquer the lake instead of working with it. So Tenochtitlan leaves two lessons. It shows the potential of building with nature, of cities that are part of the land. And it warns about over-specialization, about ignoring ecological limits. To study, it is to see both the dream of a sustainable city and the reminder that even brilliant systems are fragile. Their story makes you wonder what we're building now and what foundations we're choosing to keep or break. The story of Tenochtitlan comes to us through a mix of sources. There's Aztec myth, Spanish accounts, and later nationalist stories. To understand the city, you have to pull those threads apart. Some of the most famous stories don't hold up. Like Moctezuma thinking Cortés was a god. That idea of a king frozen by prophecy shows up strongest in Spanish writings from much later. A lot of historians think it was probably made up by friars to make the conquest seem destined, a way to say it was the fulfillment of a local prophecy. It's a powerful story, but the archaeology, the indigenous records, they don't back it up. Moctezuma's reaction looks more like a ruler's caution, facing something completely unknown. Then there's the question of scale with the ceremonial practices. The Spanish records have these huge, shocking numbers, meant to harass Europe to justify their own mission. Those descriptions had a purpose, to paint the Aztecs as savages beyond saving. The practices were real, central to their world, but the archaeological evidence suggests the numbers were exaggerated. They found the Great Skull Rack, the Ts Ampantli. Hundreds of individuals, it's a sobering find. It confirms the reality, but even that scale isn't what the old chronicles claimed. The truth is somewhere in between. In a spiritual logic, the Spanish didn't try to understand, and the Spanish accounts also played down their own dependencies. The conquest gets told as a handful of Spaniards against an empire. That's a myth. Cortés couldn't have won without the tens of thousands of local warriors. From places like Tlaxcala, Texcoco, they saw the Spanish as a tool, a way to break Aztec power for good. The siege of Tenochtitlan was largely an indigenous civil war, with European methods leading it. The Spanish diaries minimize that alliance. They focus on European courage alone, so you find a clearer picture by triangulating. You put the biased Spanish chronicles next to the archaeology, the stones, the bones. And you look at the indigenous codices, those painted books made after the conquest, often under Spanish watch but holding native views. Read together, they give you a more human picture. You see an Aztec civilization of real grandeur, profound spiritual depth, capable of amazing engineering and severe cosmological duty. And you see a conquest that wasn't a simple fight of good versus evil. It was a messy, brutal collision, where legend, justification, and hard reality are all woven together. That clearer view doesn't make the story less dramatic. It gives you more respect for the people on every side who lived through a world coming apart. Tenochtitlan was an astonishing achievement, a city built on water from a vision. It became the heart of an empire. Its story is woven with innovation, deep spirituality, and a collision that changed the world. It started with an eagle on a cactus, a people turning a swamp into a promise. They built a grid of canals and chinampas, a masterpiece of engineering. There was the sacred Precinct, a cosmology where every stone held the universe together. The Conquistadors saw it, a capital that rivaled any in the world, and then from that awe came the siege, the invisible enemy of disease, the final fall. It was more than the end of a city. It was the rupture of a cosmos, but the legacy isn't just loss. You walk through Mexico City now, you're walking on its bones. The stones of the Templo Mayor support the cathedral right beside it. The old traza of its streets still guides the flow. In the quiet canals of Xochimilco, farmers still use the Chinampa techniques. A living thread to an ancient wisdom, and on the flag that eagle and snake endure. A symbol rooting a modern identity in a deep, indigenous past. The poet Octavio Paz said Mexicans are the sons and daughters of the Great Defeat. There's truth in that. The identity was forged in that collision, carrying the memory of what was lost into what was built afterward. So this is a reminder to look beyond the ruins, past the simple tales of conquerors and conquered, to see the human spirit of creation, the ingenuity that rose from a marsh, to recognize the resilience that lets cultures transform, endure, and whisper their stories through stone and soil and symbol. Tenochtitlan was a wonder. Its absence shaped a hemisphere, and its memory asks us to remember. History is rarely a single story. It's a layered conversation between what was, what is, and what endures.